The morning sun painted the small reservation church in shades of gold and amber. Birds chirped in the cottonwood trees that surrounded the simple wooden building. Inside the tiny back room, Maria Whitehorse stood before a cracked mirror, adjusting her wedding dress for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the yellowed lace that had once been pure white. The dress was old but precious. It had belonged to her mother, who had worn it 25 years ago. Before that, it had been her grandmother's dress from a time even longer past. The fabric showed its age with small stains that would not wash out and delicate areas where the threads had begun to weaken. Near the bottom hem, there was a noticeable tear that Maria had spent hours mending with careful tiny stitches using the whitest thread she could find at the general store. Maria was 23 years old with long black hair that she had braided and pinned up in an elaborate style. Her skin was the deep brown of her Apache ancestors, and her dark eyes usually sparkled with life and humor. But today those eyes showed worry despite her attempts to appear calm and happy. She had spent the previous night unable to sleep, lying awake in her grandmother's house thinking about the new life that would begin today. Her fiancé, Thomas, was a white man from the nearby town. He worked at his father's hardware store and had a reputation as a decent, hard-working person. He had started coming into the general store where Maria worked about 14 months ago. At first, he just bought supplies and made small talk. Then he began timing his visits for when Maria was working. He brought her small gifts: ribbons for her hair, a book of poems, once a beautiful carved wooden box that she kept on her dresser. Thomas had courted her properly, asking permission to take her walking, to visit her at her grandmother's house, to take her to the town's social events. Some people in town had whispered and stared when they saw Thomas with an Apache woman. Some had been openly hostile. But Thomas had seemed not to care. He held her hand in public. He introduced her to his friends. He talked about their future together. He had proposed to her 3 months ago on a Sunday afternoon by the river. He had gotten down on one knee in the traditional way and presented her with a simple gold band. Maria had said yes immediately, her heart full of hope and love. She dreamed of the home they would make together, the children they would have, the life they would build between her world and his. Now standing in the church back room, Maria tried to push away the small voice of doubt that whispered in her mind. Thomas had seemed different lately, more distant, less eager to see her. When she mentioned the wedding, he changed the subject quickly. When she asked about where they would live, he gave vague answers. His family had not been warm to her. His mother had been especially cold, barely speaking to Maria on the few occasions they had met. Maria looked at herself in the mirror one more time. Despite the old dress and her worried thoughts, she looked beautiful. Her grandmother had said so that morning with tears in her ancient eyes. Her younger brother Carlos had whistled and said she looked like a princess. Her cousins had hugged her and whispered blessings in Apache. Through the thin wooden door, Maria could hear the sounds of people gathering in the church. Footsteps on the old floorboards, the scraping of the wooden pews as people sat down. Quiet conversations and occasional laughter. She peeked through a gap in the door and saw the church filling up with guests. On one side of the church sat her family and friends from the reservation. Her grandmother sat in the very front pew wearing her best dress and the silver jewelry that had been in their family for generations. The old woman's face was calm and dignified as always. Next to her sat Carlos, only 16 years old but trying to look grown up in his borrowed suit. Behind them were aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends from the reservation. People who had known Maria since she was born. People who had helped raise her after her parents died when she was just 7 years old. On the other side of the church, where Thomas's family and friends should be sitting, there were mostly empty pews. A few of Thomas's co-workers had come. One older couple that Maria did not recognize sat near the back. But there was no sign of Thomas's parents or his 2 brothers or any of his extended family. Maria felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Reverend Matthews knocked softly on the door. He was an elderly man with kind blue eyes and white hair. He had been the pastor of this church for 30 years and had known Maria since she was a child. He had taught her in Sunday school. He had been there when her parents were buried. He had counseled her when she struggled as a teenager caught between the traditional ways of her grandmother and the modern world of school and town. Maria opened the door just a crack. The Reverend's face showed concern and something else. Pity, perhaps, or sadness. He spoke in a low, gentle voice so others would not hear. He said that Thomas had not yet arrived. He asked if Maria knew of any reason for the delay. Perhaps there had been trouble on the road. Perhaps Thomas's wagon had broken down somewhere between town and the church. Maria forced herself to smile, though it felt like her face might crack. She told the Reverend that Thomas would be there soon. She said maybe he had forgotten something important and had to go back for it. She asked the Reverend to please wait just a little longer, just 15 more minutes. Surely Thomas would arrive soon. The Reverend nodded slowly. He patted Maria's hand in a fatherly way and returned to the front of the church. Through the door, Maria heard him address the gathered people. He said there would be a slight delay. He suggested people remain seated and patient. He said sometimes these things happen and there was no cause for alarm. But Maria felt alarm rising in her chest like a bird trying to escape a cage. Her breathing became faster. Her hands felt cold despite the warm day. Deep in her heart, in a place she did not want to acknowledge, she knew something was terribly wrong. Thomas was not coming. Thomas had changed his mind. Thomas had abandoned her. Maria stood frozen in the small back room listening to the sounds from the church. She could hear people shifting in their seats. Someone coughed. Voices whispered, though she could not make out the words. The wooden clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each passing minute. Each tick felt like a small hammer hitting her heart. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. The whispers in the church grew louder. Maria pressed her ear against the door and heard fragments of conversation. Some people spoke with sympathy. Others sounded judgmental. She heard her name mixed with words like shame and new and always. Each word cut into her like a blade. Reverend Matthews came to the door again. This time his face showed open sadness. He did not need to speak. Maria could see the truth in his eyes. He had sent someone to town to look for Thomas. The person had returned with no news. No one had seen Thomas that morning. His wagon was not at his house. His parents claimed they did not know where he was. Maria felt something inside her chest crack and splinter. All her hopes and dreams for the future shattered like glass dropped on stone. She had believed Thomas loved her. She had trusted his promises. She had ignored the warning signs because she wanted so desperately to believe that love could bridge the gap between their two worlds. The Reverend spoke gently. He said that perhaps they should tell people to go home. There was clearly not going to be a wedding today. He offered to make the announcement so Maria would not have to face everyone. His kindness made Maria want to cry, but she held the tears back through sheer force of will. She told the Reverend to wait just a little longer, just until the hour mark. Surely Thomas deserved one full hour of waiting. The Reverend looked doubtful, but he nodded and returned to the church. Maria heard him tell the gathered people that there would be a bit more delay. Some people began to leave. She heard footsteps and the creak of the church door opening and closing, opening and closing, opening and closing. After 45 minutes, her cousin Luis burst into the church. Maria heard his voice loud and agitated in the quiet space. He was calling for her. She opened the door and stepped out into the church itself for the first time. The building looked sad with its wilting wildflowers and drooping ribbons. Half the pews were now empty. Those who remained turned to stare at Maria in her old wedding dress. Luis rushed up to her. He was breathing hard like he had been running. His face was flushed and angry. He had been in town that morning at the feed store. While there, he had overheard men talking at the saloon next door. They were talking about Thomas. They were talking about the wedding that was not going to happen. Maria felt the world tilt around her. She gripped the edge of a pew to steady herself. Luis continued talking, his words tumbling out fast. Thomas had been at the saloon last night drinking with his friends. He had still been there this morning. Someone had asked him about his wedding day. Thomas had laughed. Actually laughed. He said he could not go through with it. The room seemed to spin. Maria's grandmother rose from her seat and moved to Maria's side, placing a strong hand on her granddaughter's arm. The old woman's face was like carved stone, hard and unyielding, but her eyes blazed with fury on Maria's behalf. Luis went on. Thomas had told his drinking companions that his mother had given him an ultimatum. Either he cancel the wedding or she would disown him. She would cut him out of the family business. She would tell everyone in town that he was dead to her. Thomas's mother had said she would not have a savage for a daughter-in-law. She would not have half-breed grandchildren. She would not allow her family name to be dragged through the mud. Each word Luis spoke landed like a physical blow. Maria felt them hitting her one after another. Savage, half-breed, dragged through the mud. These were the words Thomas's mother used to describe Maria, and Thomas had chosen his mother's approval over his promises to Maria. But there was more. Luis said Thomas had left town that very morning. He had packed his belongings into his wagon and headed east before dawn. He was going to stay with relatives in another state. He was running away like a coward. He did not even have the courage to come tell Maria himself. He just disappeared, leaving her standing in a church in a wedding dress waiting for a groom who was never going to arrive. The few remaining people in the church gasped and murmured. Some of Maria's cousins began shouting angrily. They wanted to go after Thomas. They wanted to make him pay for this humiliation. Her uncle stood up and began organizing men to ride to town. Maria raised her hand for silence. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but firm. She said no. Thomas was not worth their time or energy. He was not worth the trouble they would bring on themselves and their families. She said she did not want revenge. She just wanted to go home. As Maria turned to walk back toward the small room to gather her few belongings, disaster struck. The torn hem of her dress caught on the rough edge of a wooden pew. She heard the sound of fabric ripping. The small tear she had so carefully mended pulled open. The old lace gave way and the rip extended up the side of the dress nearly to her knee. Maria looked down at the ruined dress. This dress that had meant so much. This dress that carried the love and history of her mother and grandmother. Now it hung torn and sad just like her dreams. Something inside Maria finally broke. Not her spirit, but her ability to hold back emotion. Tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. Her grandmother wrapped her arms around Maria and held her tight. The old woman spoke in Apache. Words about strength and survival. Words about the warrior blood that ran in their veins. Words about how no man's weakness could diminish a woman's worth. But Maria barely heard them through her grief and humiliation. Maria pulled away from her grandmother's embrace and wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She would not cry anymore. Not here in this church where people could see her break down. Not in front of those who had stayed to witness her humiliation. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin the way her grandmother had taught her. Apache women did not crumble. They endured. She walked to the back room with as much dignity as she could gather. The torn dress dragged behind her, making a soft scraping sound on the wooden floor. In the small room, she gathered the few items she had brought. A small bag with her regular clothes. The carved wooden box Thomas had given her months ago. She looked at the box for a long moment, then left it sitting on the table. She wanted nothing from him. Nothing that would remind her of his lies and broken promises. When Maria emerged from the room, her grandmother and brother Carlos were waiting. Most of the other guests had left. Only a few close family members remained standing in small groups talking in low, angry voices. Reverend Matthews approached Maria one more time. His old face was filled with sorrow. He said he was so very sorry. He said he had believed Thomas was a good man. He said he had been wrong. Maria thanked the Reverend for his kindness. She apologized for the trouble and wasted time. The Reverend shook his head firmly. He said she had nothing to apologize for. The shame belonged entirely to Thomas. He told Maria she was a remarkable young woman and someday someone worthy of her would see that. His words were kind, but they felt hollow. Maria did not want to think about someday. She could barely think about getting through today. Her grandmother led the way out of the church. Carlos walked close to Maria's side as if ready to catch her if she stumbled. They stepped out into the bright afternoon sunshine. The contrast between the beautiful day and Maria's inner darkness felt cruel. Everything around her seemed too cheerful, too alive. The sky was impossibly blue without a single cloud. A gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Birds sang in the trees. Nature did not care that Maria's world had just collapsed. The walk back to the reservation was 5 miles along a dusty road. They had come to the church in Luis's wagon, but he had already left, taking other family members back home. Maria and her grandmother and Carlos would have to walk. Maria did not mind. In fact, she welcomed it. The physical effort of walking might distract her from the pain in her heart. They had barely gone a quarter mile when Maria heard the sound of a horse approaching from behind. The rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth grew louder. She did not turn around. She assumed it was just someone from town passing by. Someone who would probably stare at her torn dress and whisper about the failed wedding later over dinner. But the horse slowed as it came near. Then it stopped completely. A man's voice called out asking if they needed help. The voice was deep and rough like gravel, but there was kindness in it. Something in the tone made Maria turn around despite her wish to ignore everyone. Sitting on a dusty brown horse was a man Maria had never seen before. He looked to be in his middle 30s, perhaps. His face was weathered by sun and wind with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore typical cowboy clothing, faded blue jeans worn thin at the knees, a plain shirt that had once been dark blue but had faded to gray, a brown hat with sweat stains around the band, scuffed leather boots covered in trail dust. His saddle was old but well-maintained, and his saddlebags looked full and heavy. The man removed his hat in a gesture of respect. His hair was dark and hung to his collar. His eyes were a surprising light brown, almost amber in the sunlight. Those eyes looked at Maria with an expression she could not quite identify. It was not pity exactly, more like recognition, like he understood something about her situation without needing to be told. He introduced himself as James Walker. He said he had been passing through town when he heard about a wedding at the reservation church. He had stopped at the general store to buy supplies, and several people there had told him the story. A story about a bride left waiting, a groom who ran away, a dress torn in disappointment. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when the story involved scandal. Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. So everyone in town knew already. Everyone knew that Thomas had abandoned her. Everyone knew she had been rejected. Everyone was probably laughing about the foolish Apache girl who thought a white man would actually marry her. James seemed to sense her thoughts. He said quickly that he was not there to gawk or gossip. He said he had seen the church with its wedding decorations still hanging. He had seen the people leaving with sad faces. He had put the pieces together and thought maybe the bride and her family might need help getting home. Maria's first instinct was to refuse. She did not know this man. She did not need charity from strangers. She had her pride and her dignity, even if everything else had been stripped away. But her feet already hurt terribly in the tight shoes she had borrowed from a cousin. The shoes were half a size too small and had been pinching all morning. Her grandmother was 70 years old and should not walk 5 miles in the afternoon heat. Before Maria could respond, her grandmother spoke. The old woman said something in Apache. Then she repeated it in English, though her accent was thick. She said they would accept his kind offer. She looked at James with sharp, assessing eyes. Eyes that had seen many years and many people. Eyes that could judge character quickly. Whatever she saw in James made her trust him at least enough to accept a ride. James nodded respectfully to the grandmother. He said his horse could not carry all 3 of them, but he had noticed a wagon sitting near the church. If it belonged to them, he could hitch his horse and drive them properly. Carlos spoke up, saying the wagon belonged to their cousin who lived nearby. He had probably walked home rather than wait around after the failed wedding. James Walker turned his horse around and headed back toward the church without another word. Maria watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the bright blue sky. She felt strange accepting help from this stranger, but exhaustion was beginning to set in. The emotional toll of the morning combined with the heat and her painful shoes made the thought of walking 5 miles unbearable. Her grandmother stood quietly waiting. The old woman's face showed nothing, but Maria knew she was being carefully observed. Her grandmother had always been able to read people. She claimed it was a gift passed down through generations of Apache women, the ability to see beyond what people showed on the surface to what lay beneath. If her grandmother trusted this cowboy enough to accept his help, then Maria would trust that judgment. Within 15 minutes, James returned, driving the wagon. His brown horse was hitched to the front and seemed content with the new arrangement. James handled the reins with easy confidence, like someone who had been working with horses his entire life. He pulled the wagon to a stop beside them and climbed down. He helped Maria's grandmother up onto the wooden seat first. His movements were gentle and respectful. He offered his arm for support and waited patiently as the old woman settled herself. Then he turned to Maria. She hesitated for just a moment, feeling self-conscious about her torn dress and tear-stained face. But James did not stare at the rip in her dress or treat her like she was fragile. He simply offered his hand to help her up. Maria climbed onto the seat next to her grandmother. Carlos hopped into the back of the wagon, settling among some empty feed sacks. James returned to the driver's seat and with a soft click of his tongue set the horse moving. The wagon creaked and swayed as they started down the dusty road toward the reservation. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the clip-clop of the horse's hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the occasional call of a bird. Maria stared straight ahead, watching the road stretch out before them. She felt numb now. The sharp pain of betrayal had faded into a dull ache that filled her whole chest. James did not try to make conversation or offer sympathy. He did not ask what happened or tell Maria she was better off without Thomas. He simply drove the wagon and occasionally pointed out things along the road. A hawk circling high overhead searching for prey. A patch of wildflowers growing in an unlikely spot among the rocks. Animal tracks in the dust that suggested a family of coyotes had passed by recently. His observations were quiet and required no response. Maria found them oddly comforting. He was giving her something to focus on besides her own misery. Something simple and real. The world continuing on despite personal tragedy. After about a mile, her grandmother began to speak. She asked James about his horse. Where had he gotten such a fine animal? How long had they been traveling together? James answered her questions with patience. He said the horse was named Dusty because of his brown coat that always looked dusty, no matter how much he was brushed. He had bought Dusty 5 years ago from a ranch in Texas. They had covered a lot of ground together since then. Her grandmother asked where James was from originally. He said he had grown up in Texas on a ranch near the border. He had been working with horses since he was barely tall enough to reach their bellies. His father had been a rancher who believed boys should learn hard work early. James had spent his childhood mending fences, breaking horses, herding cattle, and doing whatever jobs needed doing. Maria listened to the conversation with half attention. She noticed that James spoke carefully, choosing his words. He answered her grandmother's questions but did not volunteer extra information. There was something guarded about him, something that suggested he had his own secrets and sorrows that he kept private. They traveled for another mile before her grandmother asked the question Maria knew was coming. She asked James why he had bothered to help them. She pointed out that most people from town either ignored Indians completely or treated them with open contempt, so why had a stranger stopped to offer assistance to an Apache woman left at the altar? James was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the steady rhythm of Dusty's hooves and the creaking wagon. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, more serious. He said his mother had been Comanche. His father had been a white rancher. He had grown up between two worlds, never fully belonging to either one. Maria turned to look at James properly for the first time. She studied his features, seeing things she had not noticed before. The slight copper tone to his skin that she had thought was just from sun exposure, the straightness of his black hair, the shape of his cheekbones and the set of his eyes. Signs that had been there all along, but that she had been too wrapped up in her own pain to see. Her grandmother nodded slowly as if this information confirmed something she had already suspected. She asked James about his mother. What had happened to her? James said she had died when he was 12 years old. A fever had taken her one harsh winter. His father had grieved but had eventually remarried a white woman who had never accepted James. She had her own children and made it clear that James was not truly part of the family. He said he had left home at 16 and had been moving ever since, working ranches across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and now here, never staying anywhere longer than a season or two, never putting down roots. He said it was easier to keep moving than to face the fact that he did not really belong anywhere. Maria felt a connection to this stranger's story. She understood what it meant to live between worlds. She had grown up on the reservation learning Apache ways from her grandmother, but she had also gone to the white school in town and worked at the general store. She spoke English as well as Apache. She wore both traditional clothes and modern dresses. She existed in a space between two cultures never fully accepted by either. That was why Thomas's rejection hurt so deeply. She had thought he saw past all of that. She had thought love could bridge the gap. James Walker turned his horse around and headed back toward the church without another word. Maria watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the bright blue sky. She felt strange accepting help from this stranger, but exhaustion was beginning to set in. The emotional toll of the morning combined with the heat and her painful shoes made the thought of walking 5 miles unbearable. Her grandmother stood quietly waiting. The old woman's face showed nothing, but Maria knew she was being carefully observed. Her grandmother had always been able to read people. She claimed it was a gift passed down through generations of Apache women, the ability to see beyond what people showed on the surface to what lay beneath. If her grandmother trusted this cowboy enough to accept his help, then Maria would trust that judgment. Within 15 minutes, James returned driving the wagon. His brown horse was hitched to the front and seemed content with the new arrangement. James handled the reins with easy confidence, like someone who had been working with horses his entire life. He pulled the wagon to a stop beside them and climbed down. He helped Maria's grandmother up onto the wooden seat first. His movements were gentle and respectful. He offered his arm for support and waited patiently as the old woman settled herself. Then he turned to Maria. She hesitated for just a moment, feeling self-conscious about her torn dress and tear-stained face. But James did not stare at the rip in her dress or treat her like she was fragile. He simply offered his hand to help her up. Maria climbed onto the seat next to her grandmother. Carlos hopped into the back of the wagon, settling among some empty feed sacks. James returned to the driver's seat and with a soft click of his tongue set the horse moving. The wagon creaked and swayed as they started down the dusty road toward the reservation. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the clip-clop of the horse's hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the occasional call of a bird. Maria stared straight ahead, watching the road stretch out before them. She felt numb now. The sharp pain of betrayal had faded into a dull ache that filled her whole chest. James did not try to make conversation or offer sympathy. He did not ask what happened or tell Maria she was better off without Thomas. He simply drove the wagon and occasionally pointed out things along the road. A hawk circling high overhead searching for prey. A patch of wildflowers growing in an unlikely spot among the rocks. Animal tracks in the dust that suggested a family of coyotes had passed by recently. His observations were quiet and required no response. Maria found them oddly comforting. He was giving her something to focus on besides her own misery. Something simple and real. The world continuing on despite personal tragedy. After about a mile, her grandmother began to speak. She asked James about his horse. Where had he gotten such a fine animal? How long had they been traveling together? James answered her questions with patience. He said the horse was named Dusty because of his brown coat that always looked dusty no matter how much he was brushed. He had bought Dusty 5 years ago from a ranch in Texas. They had covered a lot of ground together since then. Her grandmother asked where James was from originally. He said he had grown up in Texas on a ranch near the border. He had been working with horses since he was barely tall enough to reach their bellies. His father had been a rancher who believed boys should learn hard work early. James had spent his childhood mending fences, breaking horses, herding cattle, and doing whatever jobs needed doing. Maria listened to the conversation with half attention. She noticed that James spoke carefully, choosing his words. He answered her grandmother's questions but did not volunteer extra information. There was something guarded about him, something that suggested he had his own secrets and sorrows that he kept private. They traveled for another mile before her grandmother asked the question Maria knew was coming. She asked James why he had bothered to help them. She pointed out that most people from town either ignored Indians completely or treated them with open contempt. So why had a stranger stopped to offer assistance to an Apache woman left at the altar? James was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the steady rhythm of Dusty's hooves and the creaking wagon. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. More serious. He said his mother had been Comanche. His father had been a white rancher. He had grown up between two worlds, never fully belonging to either one. Maria turned to look at James properly for the first time. She studied his features, seeing things she had not noticed before. The slight copper tone to his skin that she had thought was just from sun exposure. The straightness of his black hair. The shape of his cheekbones and the set of his eyes. Signs that had been there all along, but that she had been too wrapped up in her own pain to see. Her grandmother nodded slowly as if this information confirmed something she had already suspected. She asked James about his mother. What had happened to her? James said she had died when he was 12 years old. A fever had taken her one harsh winter. His father had grieved but had eventually remarried a white woman who had never accepted James. She had her own children and made it clear that James was not truly part of the family. He said he had left home at 16 and had been moving ever since. Working ranches across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and now here, never staying anywhere longer than a season or two, never putting down roots. He said it was easier to keep moving than to face the fact that he did not really belong anywhere. Maria felt a connection to this stranger's story. She understood what it meant to live between worlds. She had grown up on the reservation learning Apache ways from her grandmother. But she had also gone to the white school in town and worked at the general store. She spoke English as well as Apache. She wore both traditional clothes and modern dresses. She existed in a space between two cultures never fully accepted by either. That was why Thomas's rejection hurt so deeply. She had thought he saw past all of that. She had thought love could bridge the gap. Retry SJ. The wagon rolled along the dusty road, carrying its passengers toward the reservation. Maria sat in silence, absorbing everything James had shared. His story touched something deep inside her. Here was someone who truly understood the pain of rejection based on heritage, someone who knew what it felt like to be caught between two worlds with neither one fully accepting you. Her grandmother spoke again, this time in a mixture of Apache and English. She told James about Maria's parents, how they had died in a wagon accident when Maria was only 7 years old, how she had raised Maria herself, teaching her the old ways, while also making sure she got an education at the white school. The old woman's voice carried both pride and sadness as she spoke. James listened carefully, never interrupting. He nodded at appropriate moments, showing he understood not just the words but the deeper meaning behind them. When her grandmother finished speaking, he said that Maria was lucky to have such a strong, wise woman raising her. He said his own mother had tried to teach him Comanche ways, but his father had discouraged it. His father had wanted James to be more white than Indian, believing it would make his life easier. Maria finally spoke for the first time since getting in the wagon. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. She said that trying to be something you were not never worked. People could always tell. They could sense when someone was pretending or hiding parts of themselves. She said she had tried to fit into Thomas's world. She had worn the right clothes and said the right things and tried to be the kind of woman his family would accept. But in the end, it had not mattered. To them, she would always be just an Indian. Just a savage not worthy of their son. The bitterness in her words surprised even herself. James glanced at her, his amber eyes showing understanding. He said that the problem was not with her. The problem was with people who judged others based on blood rather than character. He said Thomas had revealed himself to be weak and shallow. A man worth having would have stood by her regardless of what anyone else thought. They were getting closer to the reservation now. Maria could see familiar landmarks. The big cottonwood tree that marked the turnoff to her grandmother's house. The rocky outcrop where she and Carlos used to play as children. The small stream that ran along the eastern edge of the reservation land. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning when she left, full of hope and dreams. But Maria herself felt completely different. As they approached her grandmother's house, Maria saw that several wagons and horses were already there. Word had spread fast. Her extended family had gathered, probably to offer support and comfort. Or maybe just to hear all the details of the scandal. Maria felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She would have to face all of them. Answer their questions, accept their sympathy, endure their knowing looks. James pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the small house. It was a modest dwelling made of wood and adobe with a tin roof and a small covered porch. Her grandmother had lived there for over 40 years. The house had been home to Maria for most of her life. It represented safety and love and tradition. Right now, Maria wanted nothing more than to hide inside and never come out. James climbed down from the wagon and helped first her grandmother, then Maria down. Carlos jumped out of the back and ran toward the house where several cousins were waiting. James unhitched Dusty from the wagon and stood holding the reins, seeming uncertain whether he should leave or stay. Maria's grandmother made the decision for him. She invited James inside. She said he must be hungry and thirsty after his journey. She said it was the least they could do to offer him a meal in thanks for his kindness. James tried to decline, saying he had already imposed enough, but the old woman would not hear of it. In Apache culture, hospitality was sacred. To refuse would be insulting. James agreed with obvious reluctance. He tied Dusty to a post near a water trough and followed the women toward the house. As they climbed the porch steps, the front door opened and relatives poured out. Aunts and uncles and cousins all talking at once. They surrounded Maria with hugs and questions and exclamations of outrage over what Thomas had done. Maria felt overwhelmed by the attention. Everyone wanted to know details. Everyone had opinions about what should be done. Her uncle Miguel said he should ride to town and teach Thomas a lesson about honor. Her Aunt Rosa said Thomas's mother was an evil woman who would answer to God for her cruelty. Her cousins offered various suggestions ranging from practical to ridiculous. Through it all, James stood quietly near the edge of the porch. He did not intrude or try to insert himself into the family drama. He simply waited patiently like someone used to being on the outside looking in. Maria noticed him standing there alone and felt a rush of gratitude. This stranger had shown her more genuine kindness in one afternoon than Thomas had shown in months of courtship. Her grandmother clapped her hands sharply, calling for silence. The old woman's voice cut through the chatter. She said that Maria needed rest, not interrogation. She said there would be time later for talking. Right now they would eat together and be thankful for family. She gestured for everyone to come inside. The house was small, but somehow everyone fit. People crowded into the main room, which served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all in one. Her grandmother directed people to sit while she and Aunt Rosa began pulling food from various baskets and pots. There was fry bread and stew and roasted corn and fresh vegetables from the garden. The women worked quickly and efficiently, laying out the meal on the wooden table and on blankets spread on the floor. James was given a place of honor near the table. He protested, saying he was just a stranger who had given a ride, but her grandmother insisted. She said he was a guest and would be treated as such. She filled a plate with generous portions and set it before him. James thanked her in what sounded like Comanche. The old woman smiled for the first time that day, clearly pleased that he knew some of the language. The meal progressed with the usual noise and warmth of a large family gathering. People ate and talked and told stories. Children ran between adults, laughing and playing. The atmosphere was almost normal except for the occasional glances thrown Maria's way. Sympathetic looks mixed with curiosity. Everyone wanted to know how she was feeling, but no one wanted to ask directly. Maria sat picking at her food. She was not hungry, but forced herself to eat a few bites to please her grandmother. She watched James from across the room. He ate slowly and seemed to be enjoying the food. Several of her male cousins had engaged him in conversation, asking about his travels and his work with horses. James answered their questions with the same careful politeness he had shown earlier. After the meal, the men drifted outside to smoke and talk. The women began cleaning up, putting away leftover food and washing dishes in large basins of water. Maria helped, mechanically going through the familiar motions without really thinking. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day over and over like a terrible dream she could not wake from. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, people started to leave. They had their own homes and families to return to. Each person stopped to hug Maria and offer final words of comfort before departing. Her Uncle Miguel gripped her shoulders and told her she was strong like her mother had been. Aunt Rosa kissed her forehead and whispered that better days were coming. The cousins promised to visit soon. Finally, only Maria, her grandmother, Carlos, and James remained. The house felt very quiet after all the noise and activity. Carlos announced he was going to check on the chickens and disappeared outside. Her grandmother settled into her favorite chair near the fireplace and picked up some mending. Her gnarled fingers moved with practiced skill, even though her eyesight was not what it used to be. James stood by the door, clearly preparing to leave. He thanked Maria's grandmother for the meal and the hospitality. He said it had been a long time since he had experienced such warmth and welcome. The old woman set down her mending and looked at him with those sharp, assessing eyes. She spoke in Apache first, then translated to English. She said that James was welcome to return any time. She said their home was his home if he ever needed it. James looked genuinely moved by the offer. His weathered face softened, and for a moment Maria saw past the guarded exterior to the lonely man beneath. He said he would remember the kindness. Then he turned to Maria. He had been mostly quiet around her since they arrived, as if sensing she needed space. Now he looked at her directly and spoke words she would never forget. He said that Thomas was a fool. He said Maria deserved someone who saw her strength and honored it. Someone who would be proud to stand beside her regardless of what anyone else thought. He said that her torn dress that day had been more dignified than any fancy wedding gown could have been, because she had worn it with courage and grace. He said she should hold her head high because she had done nothing wrong. The shame belonged entirely to Thomas. Maria felt tears building in her eyes again, but these were different tears. Not tears of humiliation or heartbreak, but tears of gratitude. This stranger had given her something precious. He had given her back a small piece of her dignity. He had reminded her that she had value and worth regardless of Thomas's rejection. She thanked James with a voice thick with emotion. She said she would not forget his kindness. He nodded once, then put on his hat and walked out the door. Maria followed him onto the porch and watched as he untied Dusty and swung up into the saddle with easy grace. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, then rode away. Maria stood watching until he disappeared into the gathering dusk. The days that followed were difficult. Maria had to return to work at the general store and face the whispers and stares. Some people were kind, offering genuine sympathy. Others were less so, making snide comments or asking inappropriate questions. Maria endured it all with the dignity James had encouraged. She held her head high and did her work and refused to show how much their words hurt. Her grandmother was a constant source of strength. The old woman reminded Maria daily of who she was and where she came from. She told stories of their ancestors, warriors and healers and women who had survived impossible hardships. She said Maria had that same strength in her blood. She said one foolish man could not break what generations had built. Weeks passed. The gossip gradually died down as people found new things to talk about. Maria settled into a routine of work and home and trying to figure out what came next. She had thought her future was set. Now everything was uncertain, but slowly she began to realize that uncertainty might not be entirely bad. She had been so focused on becoming Thomas's wife that she had forgotten to think about what she wanted for herself. One Saturday afternoon, nearly a month after the failed wedding, Maria was sweeping the porch of her grandmother's house when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up and her heart did an unexpected flip. It was James riding Dusty down the path toward the house. He had returned. James pulled up near the porch and dismounted. He looked nervous, which surprised Maria. This confident, capable man suddenly seemed unsure of himself. He said he had found work at the Morrison Ranch about 15 miles away. He said the work was good and the pay was fair. He said he had been thinking about Maria and wanted to make sure she was all right. Maria invited him to sit on the porch. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway as if she had been waiting for this moment. The old woman smiled knowingly and brought out cool water and fresh bread. She set the food down, then disappeared back inside, giving them privacy. James and Maria talked for hours. He told her more about his travels and his life. She told him about growing up on the reservation and her dreams of someday opening her own store. They discovered they both loved books and horses and watching thunderstorms roll across the plains. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, as if they had known each other for years rather than weeks.